Perhaps I'm gonna introduce the procedure of the thesis defense. First, I think I'm gonna briefly introduce Chris, and then we will let Chris present about 30 minutes, and then about 10 minutes for the public question from the audience, and then we will have a closed session between the committee members, and then it will be done. Well, so Chris, I first met Chris is in my spatial database course, and he is extremely talented in the database and all those technique or skills. So I was impressed about his performance. Then I convinced him, you should do a master thesis in our department. And then finally he agreed, and that was the best thing happened.
Doesn't happen to both of you, or to you at the end? That's number one question.
Yeah, at least from my side, it's really, I'm so glad, and Chris, and you have done tremendous, wonderful job during the last 2 years, and great job. Even he do the first project with me actually is the NASA project, and the NASA director Michael is still very impressed about your performance and want to recruit you to join NASA. But anyway, and Chris anyway, so basically today he gonna report his thesis topic on spatial text mining by combine the spatial data as well as the text information from the social media, and I think that's a wonderful talk. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Chin-Yang. That was a great introduction. It's been an honor working with you over the last 2 years. And so yeah, today I'm going to be presenting my master's thesis research, and it's entitled Spatial Text Mining. This is an enhanced text mining framework for extracting disaster-relevant social media data. So to give you a brief overview about what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to give an introduction as to what is text mining related to natural disaster events. Then we're going to go into the research questions. At a high level, I'm looking to improve the accuracy of the current text mining methods for disaster events. After that, we're going to talk about the spatial text mining framework more in depth. Then we're going to talk about the experiments I designed to test this framework. After that, we'll have some conclusions and future study. So, unfortunately, disasters are common, and they often have a human impact. It's the job of disaster managers, planners, other experts to really prepare and respond to these events. Traditionally, this is done by these managers, planners, and other experts taking measurements, going to the events themselves. So, for example, you might use remote sensing to figure out the extent of a flood, or in the event of a tornado, you might send a crew to assess the damage. In the past decade, new data streams have emerged to manage these sort of disasters, uncover more data that exists. And social media is just one of these new sources, and it's become quite popular because it's simple to use, it's mobile, so we all have our smartphones now, we're always on them, and the information is timely. So once you post the information to social media, it's available for everyone to see and use. So by having users post disaster experiences, managers can better understand the scope of the disaster and get that big picture of what's going on at the disaster at that point in time. So currently social media is being used in a number of ways for disaster events. And the main themes regarding that are event detection, so finding out when a disaster event happens. Information dissemination, so this is pretty popular, reposting, retweeting after an event happens. It spreads like wildfire, pun intended. Back-channel communications, so in the case that a traditional data stream doesn't work or there's issues with that, then using social media to then communicate the information that's necessary for the disaster event. And then finally, disaster coordination and relief. So asking for a donation, looking for aid, those types of things are also included in social media for disaster events. So with millions of people posting every day on social media, the question is, well, how does one find disaster relevant information? Well, the common way right now is to use a text-based or mining approach to find this data. And the objective of this is really to develop a classifier that predicts a social media post is related to a particular disaster event. And this really follows a traditional supervised classification. So generating first a set of keywords as an initial filter. For example, maybe if there's a tornado disaster event, looking for hashtag tornado, twister, maybe something like that. Taking those posts and then sampling and annotating those particular posts as either disaster relevant or not. After that, generating the features. In this case, the features are the words, they can also be the URLs, to train the classifier. And then building the classifier. And there are a number of classification algorithms that are used for disaster events, naive Bayes, logistic regression, support vector machine. Once you have the classifier built, you can then use it to predict other posts and see whether or not they're related to a disaster event. However, this approach is not without fault. There are issues with accurately finding disaster relevant social media data. Some of it's not found at all, some of it is incorrectly identified as relevant. So why does this happen? Well, users sometimes misspell the keyword. They might not use a popular hashtag. Contextual differences. So if I say the water is too high and I'm posting this picture of this flood, am I talking about this picture or am I talking about a bathtub that's overflowing? There's differences there. No text at all. So some of the most useful information with social media for disasters are the pictures and videos that people post. But if they don't put text with it, then information is not able to be found. So how do we overcome the challenges with this current approach? Well, we know that knowledge about the location and time of a social media data post is really crucial for identifying whether or not it's relevant to the disaster. And so to improve upon this current text mining strategy, I'm proposing a new approach, which is called spatial text mining. And this integrates spatial data with the text mining classification. And here are some examples of what I'm talking about when I refer to as spatial data. So geolocated social media data, remote sensing imagery, satellite, radar, a physical model, so maybe a forecast model, and then observations as well. Now, recently there's been some research that has been done on social media data being used to enhance spatial data for disaster events. So that includes things like supporting the prediction or tracking of a disaster event, as well as enabling disaster situational awareness, getting that big picture of what's going on in a disaster event. So for example, myself and Nate, we like to go out storm chasing. Nate's right there. When we're out there and there's a tornado happening, the National Weather Service is looking for people like us to post on social media pictures of this event because they're in an office right now looking at maybe just a radar. So this allows them to get that big picture of what's really going on, happening on the ground. However, there's really been no effort to explore the extent of the spatial data that can aid for the text classification. So that's what I really want to look at and address this sort of gap in the research. And that's why I'm presenting 3 research questions related to this. So first, from this raw spatial data, how does one derive spatial features that can then be used to train for the text classifier? After that, which of those spatial features are then useful for classifying social media during a disaster event? And then finally, can the inclusion of this spatial information improve the accuracy compared to the current text-only approach for identifying social media data? So let's look at the spatial text mining framework. Here it is. This framework is intended to be used in a near real-time environment for disaster events, decision-making, etc. So starting here at the bottom, we have the data streams coming in. These include things like the social networks, Facebook, Twitter, other spatial data like environmental observations, forecast models. This then goes into the data storage and data pre-processing phase where we store the data, clean it up so that it can then be generated into spatial features, which is the next part of the framework. This is where I address my first research question as to how to identify the spatial features. Then it moves on to the text classification, and this follows that supervised classification approach. Finally is the application side, so using these classified posts that are disaster relevant for response, recovery, as well as I want to visualize the data with the spatial data. So that's where the geoanalytics part comes in as well. So now let's dive into the framework a little bit. I'll be using Hurricane Sandy as a case study to test this framework out. I picked Sandy because it happened fairly recently. There was an ample amount of social media data available for it. There was also a wide variety of spatial data that had been collected. Sandy is also a really popular study in the text mining for disaster events, so it was a means for me to kind of compare my results to. It happened late in the 2012 Atlantic hurricane season. It made landfall shortly before Halloween near Atlantic City, New Jersey. Fun fact, it wasn't actually a hurricane when it made landfall, it was an extratropical cyclone. And it was the second costliest hurricane on record after Katrina. Now I collected about 12.3 million geotag tweets and then reduced this down to about 35,000 after applying a rough spatial filter and using the keyword #Sandy. So with that case study in mind, let's go through the framework, starting with the data streams. Here's a table of the Sandy data that I collected. Here on the left are the general themes as well as the actual data source themselves. So we have things like the social network, the tweets, observations, things like the weather station, radar data, authoritative data that's coming from the National Weather Service meteorologists, like the storm reports, watches and warnings, and then model data, forecast model data. I really want to highlight here in this table the variety of spatial resolutions and temporal resolutions, as well as the formats that exist amongst this data. So things like minutes to hours, point, raster, polygon, all of these different data types. And it was over 100 gigabytes roughly of data. So there was a big data challenge that was posed to me, and that's where in the next part of the framework we really address how to pre-process and store this data so that it can be aggregated for the feature generation. So let's move on to the next step. First, looking at the data storage. Social media services utilize what's called a NoSQL model, or not only SQL, because social media posts are often flexible in the types of attributes that are included with that data, compared to the relational model, which is the kind of standard database model. So I use a NoSQL database called MongoDB to store the social media posts. For the meteorological data, I use Postgres with a PostGIS extension. This is because it can handle both vector and raster data. It's open source like MongoDB, and it provides a wide range of spatial functionality, so I can access the data that existed in there. As for the data pre-processing, another unique aspect of this spatial text mining framework is its ability to dynamically spatially filter the information. So as opposed to the traditional method, it would just be to take a bounding box. So here's the study area that I have for the hurricane case study. It would just be to collect all the data in here. However, the spatial text mining framework looks at at what point in time the hurricane is located and what its spatial extent is. So here you can see the track of the hurricane. So the data is collected based on where the hurricane is, and that's the focus point. And that's what happens in this event metadata extraction. The other thing that has to happen is the geoprocessing, so just simple things like reprojecting the data, cleaning up the attributes, etc. Then we move on to really what the core of the spatial text mining framework is. This is the spatial feature extraction. This is where I address my first research question. It's really the core of the framework. So this is a table of the spatial feature extraction logic that I generated. Hurricanes are characterized by heavy rain, high winds, low atmospheric pressure. So when I came up with my features that I wanted to incorporate, I focused on those first. And you can see that here in this left column. So things like the storm category, precipitation, wind, is it flooding, those types of things. I also included some more general features like the distance away from the hurricane center, as well as time here is referring to whether or not the storm has passed the social media point or not. And so what happens in this logic is, given a geolocated social media post, the framework generates spatial features for the post using fuzzy logic which ranks the possible data source based on their spatial and temporal relationship to that point. So that's what you see here in this right column. So these numbers indicate the rank that I had for that particular feature. So once a data source is selected for that particular feature, then what happens is using meteorological scales, the data values are then transferred to integers, which can be interpreted by the classifier. So now we have social media posts that have spatial features attached to them. It's time to do the text classification. And so this is using, again, the standard supervised classification approach. The first part then is doing the text coding and coming up with the classification scheme. Now I use a previously derived classification scheme for disaster events. It's a two-part classification scheme. The first part is to generally break up the posts into three categories. Personal, which are posts that are just interested for the user and maybe the user's friends. Informative, these are the posts that are of interest to everyone, and then other. After that first classification is done, then 5 subclasses are derived for the informative class, and that's what you see right here. These include caution and advice, casualties and damage, so if it's something about damage, information sources, these are official news source or from a government official. People, so if people are found or missing, and then donation and aid, so anything requiring goods, services, asking for help, those types of things, donation and aid. So with the text classification scheme complete, it was time to sample and then annotate these posts. So of the 35,000, I took a random sample of 5,000 social media posts and labeled them with that first classification scheme, personal, informative, and other. From there I found that there were about 1,900 informative posts, and I further classified those into the 5 subclasses. And these are the classes that I'll be using in the classification experiments that I'm running. You see on your right here this table of the frequency for each of these subclasses. Caution advice was by far the dominant class, 1,300 posts. I also want to highlight here this, the people, there was only 2 posts, so I did remove that from the further analysis because there weren't enough posts to actually run the classification on. With the post now annotated, it was time to figure out how I was going to evaluate and validate the model that I was going to generate. So I use a 10-fold cross-validation, which is used to estimate the fit of the model. So essentially you break up the 1,900 posts into 10 different folds. 9 of them are the training fold, and then there's a test fold. This is iteratively done so that each fold gets to be the test fold, and then you average the results from there. To assess the accuracy of these models, I used 3 different metrics: precision, recall, and F-score. So precision here, we're looking at the relevancy of the classifier, or the true positives over all of those selected items. And then recall, that's dealing more with the sensitivity of the classifier. So looking at the true positives as a ratio of the relevant elements as a whole. F-score is just the harmonic mean between the precision and the recall, and that's what I ended up using as my ultimate metric for comparing the different experiments. So the final phase of the spatial text mining framework is the applications. And this is again to assist disaster managers in making those real-time decisions required during a disaster event. And I've placed all of the spatial data in Real Earth, which is a geovisualization tool developed by the Space Science and Engineering Center. So you can go and view all of the spatial data as well as the tweets up in Real Earth right now. And that was to kind of just test out how one might visualize the data. So looking at the 1,900 sample posts, on your right here is the spatial distribution, and then on your left is the temporal distribution of the data. I really want to highlight the temporal distribution as it relates to the individual classes here, colored in these different colors. So things like caution advice and information sources tend to happen before and during the disaster event. That's where we see the peaks. And the casualty damage, donation, and aid, those tend to happen after the disaster event has occurred. And this makes sense. Yes?
No W's in the Real Earth URL, just so you know.
Okay, yes, that is right.
It'll be a broken link otherwise. Thank you.
I forgot about that. So now let's move on to testing the spatial text mining framework and the experience that I used and the So just a reminder of the research questions that I had. I addressed the first research question in the spatial feature generation using that fuzzy logic. Now we're going to focus on the next two questions. So which ones are the key features, and including these spatial features, does it actually improve over the current methods? So this is the table here of the experiments I designed. The rows here are the different features that I included, and then the columns here are the different experiments. I used the text only as a control. Again, this is following the previous methods that are being used right now. So I only used the text feature there. And then we did 5 other experiments. There was a hypothesis that I had that said distance and time would probably be the most influential based on kind of what we saw with the data before. So I wanted to include a few experiments that looked at different ways to include distance and time features. So that's what these 3 are right here. So with those in mind, I first had to determine which algorithm I would use for the remainder of the experiments. And I used the text-only experiment to compare my results. And these are the results right here for naive Bayes, logistic regression, and support vector machine. Support vector machine had the highest F-score. And this makes sense because support vector machine can better handle the sample class size variability. So we saw that the caution advice had an extremely large number of samples, and the other ones had only a few. So support vector machine can handle that much better than naive Bayes and logistic regression. So now moving on to the results from the different experiments. Highlighting my third research question right away, here's the text only and the average F-score. All of my other experiments did improve on the accuracy compared to the text-only approach. And when we look specifically as to which one performed the best, that was the enhanced proximity and time experiment. And so that's including features like distance and time with the text. I was really hoping the meteorological features would perform a little bit better, but they only had a slight improvement over the text-only methods. So now that we have that in mind, let's dig a little deeper into the specific class breakdown for enhanced proximity and time as it compares to the text experiment. So that's what this is a table of. So here we have precision recall, F-score, and then the text experiments, and then the proximity and time, as well as the classes breaking down the rows here. And I want to highlight the damage and donation classes first because they actually did improve their recall, resulting in a higher F-score. And this makes sense. This suggests that distance and time impacts the post related to damage and donation. So if I'm going to post something about damage or donation, it's likely because I'm near the disaster event. I've been impacted by the disaster event. So those results make sense. On the flip side, information source and to some extent the caution advice decreased in their recall when I added spatial features in. So that's what we see right here. And what this suggests is that distance and time are not as important for classifying those particular classes. And this also kind of makes sense because if you think about Fox News or MSNBC posting something on social media, it doesn't matter where they're posting that in particular. It's about the content, the text that they have. So I wanted to dig a little bit deeper and look at individual posts and why we saw the results that we did. So that's when I performed a sensitivity assessment. And so what I'm doing here is comparing the classification between the text only and the enhanced proximity and time for each post. So an example of this would be I might have labeled a post as the damage class, and then the text only classified it as caution, and the proximity and time experiment classified as damage. Well then what happened was the post went from being incorrectly classified to being correctly classified with the addition of those spatial features. So if we look here, on your left is the spatial distribution of the posts that went from wrong to correct. And then on your right here is the distribution from correct to wrong. And more posts shifted from wrong to correct than correct to wrong, which is good. In general though, most posts either stayed wrong or stayed correct between these two experiments here. And really looking at the post, looking at the features, I noticed that the distance from the center of the hurricane was about the same for all of these posts. However, it was the time feature that was different. So in the case of the wrong to correct, we saw that the time made sense for that particular class. So the damage time then was after the disaster occurred, caution advice was during. However, with the correct to wrong, the times were not necessarily correct. So the caution advice might have happened a week after the disaster occurred. And so what this suggests is that the combination of distance and time is really key for classifying the spatial features. And that's what answers my second research question. So to conclude, spatial text mining framework was proposed to incorporate spatial data into the text classification for disaster-relevant social media posts. Distance and time at which the post occurred are really the key features, in addition to the text, for classifying posts during a disaster event. And the inclusion of spatial features into the text classification did in fact improve the overall classification accuracy compared to the current methods that are being used. And finally, the classes that were rooted in space and time, so donation and damage, those showed a greater improvement in the classification accuracy compared to those more generic classes like caution advice and information source. So, my future studies. I'm really interested in looking at the spatial feature definition optimization. So right now, using that fuzzy logic, I think that there can be enhancements to that to improve the performance. Also testing ensemble classification methods. So I only tested 3 different popular methods for classifying the post. It would be useful to check out other ensemble classification methods. Then comparing the classification results with other disaster events. So I looked at a hurricane. Well, how does it compare to a tornado or a flood event? That would also be useful. And then finally, improving the coding schema for text classification, really to leverage those spatial features. So right now, I used a classification scheme that was really meant for text classification, but with adjustments, possibly that could enhance the spatial features that have been added to the classification. So with that, thank you again for coming, and I can take questions.
Time control.
What's the theory, right? Yeah.
Why, so just a casual hypothesis, because I know it wasn't included in research studies, but why do you think there were so few people tweets?
That's a really good question. So the 2 that I had were actually about the same person. So one person was looking for it, and the other person responded that they found them. I think people use other means to look for people, at least maybe in the United States. It might be different in another country, different disaster event. I know with the Haiti earthquake, people were posting a lot about finding other people. So yeah, I think it varies on the disaster and kind of where the disaster happened. Yeah.
How do you think your proximity and time measure would change if it was like a quicker disaster, right? So a hurricane, happens over a longer period of time, but I'm thinking like tornado or earthquake.
Absolutely. So I had collected data for a tornado and a flooding event to kind of test that extent variability. And I think it would show a greater impact, especially with a tornado, right? That happens in a very small area. Versus something like an earthquake that might be a larger. So there is some domain knowledge, I think, that has to go into each disaster when using this framework to kind of really bring the necessary information for the feature extraction. Yeah?
So you talked about the contextual difference when
Yeah.
we do text mining. Do you think the spatial text mining framework can address this kind of problem?
I think it's a step in the right direction, and I really hope to see some evidence that the pictures and things like that also are improved with this sort of framework. I couldn't find in my sample a case where there was a contextual difference. People were really talking about Sandy. I think looking at other tweets that didn't maybe have hashtag Sandy in it would allow me to see some of those contextual differences.
Excellent work. I was wondering, can you go back to the slide where you compare your differences? Yeah, this one here.
This one? Yeah.
So you have very, you have a lot of precision on those numbers.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you had a confidence interval on those to see like what the uncertainty was and like if any of them kind of overlap.
Sure. That is something I didn't look into, but I think it would be necessary for really trying to weed out why we saw that like higher precision in there. That was something that I've seen in other literature as well with text mining. Precision is often very high. It's that recall that there's a struggle with. So.
Just to add this, the number is the average of the tenfold cross-validation, right?
Correct.
So you can compute the standard deviation for each of these numbers. That
Yeah.
would be a measure of uncertainty.
Yeah.
I have another question.
Uh-huh.
On the precision and the recall, just to clarify, can you explain like how are these two measures computed and what's the difference? What different aspects of the accuracy?
Yeah, so we're looking at the difference between whether a post is relevant versus the sensitivity. Where's the...
Do you have a equation or something?
I showed a general graphic. I didn't put the equation up there.
Yeah, here.
So here, yeah, again, so when looking at the classifier, when we're talking about precision here, we're looking at posts like, for example, let's say damage or something like that. Posts that are actually damaged, as well as over the ratio of posts that were also not damaged but classified as damaged. And this is compared to the recall, which is more of that sensitivity measurement, which is looking at, well, here are the posts that are actually damaged that were classified as damaged over also those posts that were the false negatives classified as damage. So.
Like basically, precision is a true positive over predicted
true-
positive.
Over the true positive
True
and
positive.
the false positive. So everything that was predicted as damage.
Okay.
So it's the actual damage over everything that was predicted as damage versus the damage that's predicted over that with the false negatives. So does that make sense?
Sounds like user accuracy. More sensing.
Yeah, it's very similar to user accuracy and producer
Because
accuracy.
more kind of producer's accuracy.
Yeah.
If that anybody want to relate to that?
Yeah. Yeah, if you look at the confusion matrix,
Yeah.
that's sort of the
Yeah. Because
Can you go forward to the slide where you describe your data sources?
backwards.
Forward. Next one? That one.
Yeah.
So I see you're using a 1 gram for your text feature, and I was wondering if you considered using like bigrams or trigrams or anything like more than one,
Yeah.
and how you think it would change your results.
That's a really good question. So I did check out the diagram, and what I saw was the results didn't change a whole lot. So I just went with the single gram because that was what was used in other literature at the time. I think it's a little bit faster. It would be interesting though to check the n gram, right? So maybe there's a point at which adding so many, would make a difference. But yeah, usually you see just a 1 gram being used to do the text classification.
So did you filter out retweets and how did you deal with that?
Yeah, so anything that had RT in it was removed from it. Because again, if you have people retweeting about a disaster event, they're not necessarily near the disaster event.
And then during an event as long as Sandy, didn't the hashtags change and how did you accommodate that?
Yeah, so I used hashtag Sandy as the sort of primary filter, and after that, it was removed. All the hashtags were removed from the actual text classification, so I didn't include the hashtag in it. There was a lot of junky hashtags that were used, and I thought that that might impact the classifier too much. If it always saw the same hashtag over and over again, it might misclassify it.
Any other questions?
Yeah, Chris.
So this is obviously a framework for post-event. Do you think we could develop a software tool that could be applied in real time to help on-the-ground disaster managers
Sure. So
deploy those resources?
yeah, that's a really good question. So this is meant to be sort of a near real-time framework, actually. So using it in that real-time context, there are already softwares out there that allow folks like the Red Cross, FEMA to collect this sort of data. But again, they're only using the text classifiers right now. But these are fairly comprehensive classification. You know, they're looking at millions of tweets added into the training data. So it would be useful to see how this framework compares to those specific softwares that are already out there.
So you used the NOM forecasting model
Yeah.
early on, and I saw it was ranked really low when you did your evaluation of data sources, and I'm wondering why that is and whether you think there's potential of using that in the future.
Sure. So at first I had the idea that I wanted to be able to also predict if a feature might experience the disaster. So maybe like if, for example, a feature was, I don't know, like up here and a hurricane was down here, using that forecasting model to say, oh, well, in 24 hours from now, it's actually going to be over that person's location. I didn't end up pursuing that route, but the forecasting models did fill in some of the gaps where some of the other data sources did not have any data. A good example of that was with the radar. I used 6 different radar stations, and there were a few holes. So in that case, I had filled it in with the NAM, and then there's the precip analysis also included in that. So I think it could be useful if you were to then try to predict where the storm is moving next, but you have to be very careful as to how far you look in the future. So I only included data that existed within the 6-hour time steps between the model runs. So I didn't look 84 hours into the future and use that data. It was only in that sort of window where there's a gap.
So were people tweeting before the storm arrived about the storm?
Correct, yeah. So I had the data started on the 28th, and the storm didn't hit until 29th, 30th.
Okay.
So people were talking about, missing, food, long gas lines, those sorts of things.
Okay.
Yeah. If there is no further question, we will move to closed session.
Take
Thank
some
you for
cookies.
coming.
Take some cookies.
Thanks.